In the autumn of 1962, one man with limited knowledge made a decision that prevented an attack and probably saved the world from all-out nuclear war. It happened like this. In this week's episode, we will look back at a time in history where nuclear tensions reached their peak and global superpowers came very close to World War III and destroying the world as we know it. The Cold War came about after the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. Power was divided between the two victors, America and its NATO allies in the West, and the Soviet Union in the East. Tension and a struggle for dominance between the two powers lasted nearly 45 years, and in that time, both powers built up huge militaries and nuclear arsenals. Though both powers never came into direct military conflict with each other, both jostled for supremacy via proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, the space race, and a host of other ways. Things reached a fever pitch, however, in 1962. Though most of the Soviet Union's power and alliances were in the East, one of their allies emerged in the West and very close to the USA. That ally was Cuba. Cuba is an island nation just below Florida, and in the years before 1962, it had a communist revolution, led by Fidel Castro, which was at odds with American democracy. The USSR, being the large communist powerhouse that it was, saw this as an opportunity to flex their power and ideology in the US's backyard. And America actually initially supported the revolution in Cuba, thinking it would bring democracy to Latin America. But when Castro legalized the Communist Party and executions of soldiers and police started happening, the writing was on the wall and the two countries' relationship soured. In 1960, the Americans planned a revolution of their own by training Cuban refugees to overthrow Castro's government. In 1961, 1,500 troops landed on the beaches in Cuba, supported by the US, but were ultimately defeated. This, coupled with sanctions and the deployment of American nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, pushed relations between the Soviet Union and Cuba closer together. It wasn't long before a local revolution turned into a global crisis. Following the failed invasion, the US increased and escalated the sponsorship of terrorism against Cuba. In late 1961, Castro asked the Soviet Union for more anti-aircraft missiles. The Soviets, however, ignored the request. This led Cuba to begin economic talks with another communist regime, China, and in the spring of 1962, Cuba even ousted a high-ranking Moscow-aligned Cuban politician. All of this alarmed the Soviet leadership, and soon after they organised a delegation to Havana to discuss the building of more missiles. At that meeting, they discussed Cuba's need for more missiles, but would also, crucially, plan to place strategic nuclear weapons in secret in Cuba. The plans were approved in July by Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party, and over the next 2 months, under extreme secrecy and deception from Moscow, the missile depots were built in Cuba, with the first nuclear-capable missiles arriving by night in early September. During this time, the US had grown suspicious of the plot, but were also tentative about using their U-2 spy planes, as they feared the shooting down of one would cause another incident and increase tensions. And after a Taiwanese-operated U-2 plane was shot down over China, they halted the spying for over a month. It wasn't then until early October that the US began spying again, and on the 14th of October they got their proof. They captured nearly 1,000 images of ongoing construction, and newly built missile sites in the Cuban countryside. The next day, the CIA confirmed the images and President JFK convened his team of experts, known as XCOM, to discuss what to do next. They discussed many options, but ultimately they had to decide between three: diplomacy with Cuba and the Soviet Union, a blockade of missiles arriving to Cuba, or a direct attack. JFK favoured the blockade, but decided to use the term quarantine instead. A military blockade is an act of war, something JFK wanted to avoid. A few days later, on October 22nd, JFK addressed the nation.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The speech signalled the beginning of the blockade and the deepening of the crisis. Over the next few days, letters would go back and forth between Kennedy and Khrushchev. The US accused the Soviets of trying to start a nuclear war and demanded them to remove the missiles. The Soviets, in turn, blamed the US for the blockade and said that the missiles are for defensive purposes only. US ships move in close to blockade Cuba. Soviet submarines move in the Caribbean and US B-52 bombers hover in the sky in range of Moscow. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I do all the production, research, editing and mixing, everything myself, and I really appreciate every listener that I get. You can support the podcast by joining my Patreon for just $5 a month, where you get access to some bonus content. I'm also on social media and YouTube. I'm glad you are enjoying It Happened Like This, and I'm very thankful for your support. Now back to the episode. Freighters bound for Cuba turn back towards the Soviet Union. However, an oil tanker known as the Bucharest continues. 2 US ships prepare to intercept the tanker, which could have led to war. However, JFK lets the tanker through because it doesn't contain arms. At this stage, things seemed at a stalemate, with neither side looking like they would back down. The very next day, however, Khrushchev saw sense and wrote an impassioned letter to JFK calling for de-escalation. That same day, Castro sent a telegram to Khrushchev encouraging him to preemptively strike the US. Negotiations and communication seemed to be improving. However, the very next day, Cuba shot down an American refueling aircraft, killing the pilot. Spy aircraft were also shot at that day. October 27th, which came to be known as Black Saturday, the world really did come close to nuclear war. Kennedy responded to Khrushchev's letters and agreed to a de-escalation, a removal of the blockade and an assurance of no invasion of Cuba in exchange for the removal of the missile sites. This same day, Castro's telegram arrived urging for a first-use nuclear strike. If that wasn't enough, the same day, a US spy plane accidentally entered Soviet airspace. The Soviets scrambled jets, to which the US did so in return. The US jet fighters, however, contained nuclear air-to-air missiles. A launch of nuclear missiles was narrowly avoided. With all of the negotiations and spying going on in the background, it was a Soviet submarine that really could have started it all. The US Navy dropped a series of signalling depth charges over a sub at the blockade line. the US were unaware that this submarine was armed with nuclear missiles and had orders to launch if damaged by depth charges. The submarine in question, the K-19, was running low on air and was surrounded by American warships. It really needed to surface soon. Because the sub was so deep, it also couldn't monitor radio signals and was essentially cut off from outside communication. On board were 3 high-ranking officials: the captain, Valentin Savitsky, political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and captain of the submarine flotilla Vasily Arkhipov. Normally, a decision to launch would only require a decision from the 2 high-ranking officers on board, but on this occasion, Vasily happened to be there, so it required 3. Savitsky and Maslenikov were exhausted and furious, and they ordered the launch. Vasily Arkhipov said no. The 3 argued. It is unclear whether or not Arkhipov finally convinced Savitsky, or if he came to the conclusion himself, but the launch was narrowly averted and the submarine surfaced. If Arkhipov had not been on board, or had not held the nerve to say no in the face of a perceived attack and pressure from 2 high-ranking officials, a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead would have been launched. World War III would have broken out, and the world we know today would not exist as we know it. In the days and months following, agreements were made, and the crisis ended. When Arkhipov and the crew returned to the Soviet Union, however, his peers were furious with them. One admiral told him, "It would have been better if you had gone down with your ship." Arkhipov, as we learned, was not easily rattled, however, and after intense interviews and interrogation would continue his naval service, eventually being promoted to Rear Admiral and head of the Kirov Naval Academy. I wanted to talk about this because, depending on when you're listening to this episode, currently world events are in some ways not too dissimilar to what happened all those years ago in the 60s. Russia are at war with Ukraine. Tensions between the big nuclear powers are at an all-time high. Tensions between Russia, of course, and NATO. Tensions between America and China over Taiwan. NATO is expanding. Recently, Finland joined, and Sweden looks set to join very soon. So this threat of nuclear war has not gone away. At the same time, in the cinemas right now, we have Oppenheimer, who is credited with testing the first atom bomb. So it's a pertinent time to talk about this, I think. The craziest thing about it all is that it could come down to, it's almost cartoonish how nuclear war could start with the decision of one person. We've all heard of like the briefcase, and we have this idea of the big red button, but 3 guys in a submarine in the Caribbean could have started World War III. And if it wasn't for one man's level-headedness, things could be very different. And in many ways, we haven't really learned any lessons from that time. There have been agreements since then with, scaling back the number of nuclear warheads that each nation has, but there's still a lot of them out there. I guess the flip side to that is we've had the technology to destroy ourselves for decades, and we haven't. So when you hear about AI and all the dangers of that, I guess cooler heads have prevailed, and we have to assume that they will continue to do so. But it's definitely crazy to think about that it doesn't take a whole lot for things to kick off. Researching this episode, there's so much secrecy and deception going on in politics and discussions and in the background that it makes you wonder. I guess we only hear one side of things and we only see what the media tells us, but there's so much happening in the shadows and happening in the background that we just don't know. What we can say is we're lucky that Vasily Arkhipov was on that submarine and he stood up and said no. So that's the story of the most dangerous day in history. How the world came to the brink of nuclear war and how one man stopped it from happening.